Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. In this seminar, we will discuss Hegel's circular epistemology. Very happy to be discussing Hegel with you. So if you have read pretty much any Deleuze at all, then you know that Deleuze has some very humorous, but also some very derogatory things to say about Hegel. Hegel, there was absolutely a period of time, some would say that we're still in that period of time, when Hegel was considered it's just so difficult for me to say these things, right? One of, if not the greatest philosopher ever, right? When we hear philosophers say things like somehow Nietzsche or Heidegger is somehow responsible for the Nazis, I actually think that it's Hegel who is responsible for the Nazis. It's not Nietzsche or Heidegger, but that's a talk for a different time. I do want to start by saying that when I studied for my PhD at Duquesne University, I was in fact a student of Dr. Tom Rockmore. I think that Dr. Rockmore is brilliant. His books are absolutely fabulous. I can think of at least 4 or 5 books right off the top of my head that I think, you read these books and you walk away from those books feeling as though like, wow, I've really learned something. And this something that I've learned has really given me the capacity for great insight into these primary sources. So I really appreciate Dr. Rockmore, and I truly feel as though I am blessed to have been a student of Dr. Rockmore's. I actually took Dr. Rockmore's graduate seminar on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I was also blessed to be able to, meet with him on a number of occasions. We even were able to break bread on a couple of occasions together, and I very much appreciate that. So, and I encourage you that if you're looking for books by Dr. Rockmore to read, I highly, highly recommend 2 books. There's many books, but 2 books. The first one is In Kant's Wake, and the second one is Kant and Phenomenology. I know there's a number of other books that some would say were probably even better than those 2 books, but I think that reading those 2 books can tremendously benefit you in terms of understanding the history of philosophy. All right, so Hegel's circular epistemology. In terms of an overview, then, these are the sections of this seminar. What is epistemology? Circular versus non-circular justification. Aristotle on circular justification, logical circularity as fallacious. Hegel's phenomenology's original titles. And I feel as though, again, I have to thank Dr. Rockmore for this insight, but when you see what Hegel considered to be the original titles of the Phenomenology of Spirit, and you recognize that Miller essentially took the liberty of making up the title, the Phenomenology of Spirit, then you realize that it's really not a mystery what the Phenomenology of Spirit is about. In fact, the title itself pretty much says it. So here we go. The original titles of Hegel's Phenomenology were Science of the Experience of Consciousness. Can you imagine if the Phenomenology of Spirit was titled Science of the Experience of Consciousness? Very, very different looking book from the outside. And then the Science of the Phenomenology of Spirit. And even just this addition of the Science of the Phenomenology of Spirit, it seems to me, properly contextualizes the text. So I think that either one of those titles, and those were titles that Hegel himself was considering, either one of those titles would be better than just the Phenomenology of Spirit. Okay, Hegel's circular epistemology. In order to talk about this, I have, over a long period of time, especially while working on my dissertation, I really just went after Hegel. And not the least of which was the motivation for that was Kant, Schelling, and Schopenhauer, three philosophers whom I think are absolutely great. So in order to work this out, I've put together a number of illustrations, and because if you know anything about Hegel, you know he is notoriously complicated. So I've worked out some illustrations and using my color coding of these PowerPoint slides also to sort of help make this easier to digest. So what we're going to be looking at in order to understand Hegel's circular epistemology is this distinction between, on the one hand, the given and the thing, and on the other hand, intellectual and non-intellectual intuition. Okay. Then, and I think that this is extremely important for people who don't, and I think that it's helpful for me to say this, so please allow me to say this. I am in no way, shape, or form trying to be snarky or something like that. But I think that for people who don't understand the history of philosophy, what they don't understand is that there are a number of mistakes that manifest or appear for the first time in philosophy. They have a historical date on them, right? So they appear somewhere in the history of philosophy. And by recognizing that they appear somewhere in the history of philosophy, you can recognize how the people around that appearance, how around that manifestation immediately related to it. And sometimes it's very helpful to see that. And on the other hand, it's also the case that these mistakes ripple through the history of philosophy. And so, just as all ideas do, right? But so the idea is that, so some people don't realize that they are thinking in terms of these errors, and errors that were clearly pointed out by other philosophers as such. They don't realize that that's the case because they're unaware of the history of these thoughts. So I think that it's important to properly contextualize these thoughts. And in my opinion, this is the only place from which Hegel's system can be completely deconstructed. And that is a huge claim on my part, right? But what you'll find if you've ever studied Hegel, and if you've ever tried to understand Hegel, is that once you get into the text, once you are past the preface, as it were, once you are deeper into the text, then you are already caught in the snares of his logic. So we must sort this out immediately, right? At the very point of contact with reality. Hence the given and the thing on one hand, and intellectual and non-intellectual intuition on the other hand. And again, I know that I'm about to repeat myself, but I think that it is important to say this and to stress it yet again, and that is that this is not something that I have made up, right? If you go back, even though Kant was unaware, Kant was long dead by the time the Phenomenology of Spirit appeared, Kant was able to say, in regard to his own philosophy, that there are several different ways to read his philosophy, and that one of these ways results in something that Kant called transcendental illusion. And Kant said that it's a mistake to read his philosophy that way. Okay, now, Schelling initially started to read Kant's philosophy that way. Schelling realized that that was a mistake, and he backed away from it. But Hegel picked it up, and Hegel essentially worked it out. Again, the problem, though, is that it results in a mistaken reading of Kant. And this is a hugely complicated and subtle issue if you let it get too far down the road, right? And so the point that I'm trying to stress here is that I didn't make this up, right? I am looking at the history of philosophy by way of my teachers in the past, with the help of my teachers in the past, looking at the history of philosophy and extracting what amounts to critiques of Hegel by Hegel's contemporaries or by the masters of the ideas that Hegel himself was trying to work out. So I think it's very important to take that into consideration. And if you're unaware of it, Hegel is absolutely dominating continental philosophy still, it seems to me. And Hegel's, I've said this in a number of places, but Hegel's reversion, in a sense, is a reversion to Descartes post-Kant. And that's highly problematic. But so what you find is that in contemporary continental philosophy, for example, and also actually analytic philosophy, because as some of the greatest analytic philosophers on the planet have finally come around to realizing, is that analytic philosophy can be traced back, and this should be no surprise, that analytic philosophy can be traced back to the philosophy of Hegel. So the idea here is that contemporary philosophy is in some way dominated by a couple fundamental mistakes. Those fundamental mistakes are Cartesian and Hegelian in nature. And if you are able to recognize Hegel's circular epistemology and you are able to catch it before you get ensnared in his logic, then you are able to completely deconstruct the Hegelian philosophy. Again, I stand with Deleuze on this. I stand with Jacques Derrida on this. And most importantly of all, I stand with Kant on this. Okay, so this dilemma is also present in Buddhist ontology. And I think it's important to recognize that as well, that in Eastern philosophy, we also find these ideas and these constructions. So Hegel's answer is one way to understand Plato's forms. I think it's also important to sort of, highlight or frame Hegel's philosophy as a way to interpret Plato's forms. So we'll talk about that also. And then Hegel's absolute one misunderstands the ontological difference. It misunderstands ontological difference, interpreting difference in terms of identity. So it interprets difference in terms of identity. And you see here that for, within the confines of this seminar, I'm using these colors. So difference and the given and the thing are appearing in orange, and intellectual and non-intellectual intuition are appearing in blue, and identity is appearing in blue. I believe that I definitely tried, and I hope that I remained consistent with those colors throughout this presentation. All right, here we go. So, criteriology versus epistemology. So criteriology is the wider term. It took me a long time to come to criteriology, and really, in a sense, I came to criteriology beyond what my teachers wanted me to do, but I just fully stand by this idea that we should be using the word criteriology and not the word epistemology, because epistemology just narrows the scope too much. All right, so criteriology understood, for example, as a category containing theories of certainty, theories of identification, theories of justification, and theories of knowledge. Thus, epistemology, as the study or the science of knowledge, is smaller in scope and is contained in the category of criteriology. All right, so you can see the cover of Dr. Rockmore's text there, Hegel's circular epistemology. So circular versus non-circular justification. So, quote, I'm quoting Dr. Rockmore here, quote, circular arguments differ from linear in that an argument can be said to be circular if earlier propositions in the chain of reasoning are justified by their relation to later propositions, which in some sense follow from them. Yes, absolutely that is being said. So, you'll be taught pretty much in every logic class that this is fallacious, that this is a problem, right? But here we see Dr. Rockmore, who is, in my opinion, the world's foremost living Hegel scholar at this point in time. I know that's going to upset some people, perhaps, but Rockmore is a towering figure in terms of Hegel scholarship. And so here we have Rockmore explaining what Hegel is up to, and it really is worth reading one more time. So, circular arguments differ from linear in that an argument can be said to be circular if earlier propositions in the chain of reasoning are justified by their relation to later propositions, which in some sense follow from the earlier propositions. So, okay. Aristotle on circular justification. This comes from the Posterior Analytics. We can see Book 1, Chapter 3, 72b, 25. So, demonstration in the absolute sense is obviously impossible by the circular method. That is, if demonstration must proceed from premises which are prior and better known, for the same things cannot be at once prior and posterior to the same things, except in different senses. He's talking here about the chain of reasoning that Dr. Rockmore was just mentioning. I mean the distinction between prior to us and absolutely prior, with which we become familiar through induction. In this case, our definition of absolute knowledge will be unsatisfactory, because it will have a double meaning. But presumably, the other mode of demonstration, proceeding from that which is better known to us, is not demonstration in the absolute sense. Those who profess that demonstration is circular are faced not only by the consequence just described, but also by the following. Their theory simply amounts to this, that a thing is so if it is so. And that is a tautology. And it is easy to prove anything by this method. That this is all that follows will be clearly seen if we take three terms, for it makes no difference whether we say that a circular proof is effected through many or few terms, provided that there are not fewer than two. Okay, so before we take a look going further here, what we see from Aristotle's Posterior Analytics is that circular demonstration proves nothing new, and that circular demonstration is tautological. I wrote an article, a journal article titled "Tales of the Mighty Tautologists," and well, this is not the place to discuss it. Logical circularity as fallacious. So here we see a circular reasoning fallacy occurs when the evidence offered to support a claim is just a repetition of the claim itself. And here we have a passage from Sextus Empiricus. When the argument reduces itself to a form of circular reasoning, the discovery of the criterion becomes practically impossible, since we do not allow them to adopt a criterion by assumption. In other words, you can't just simply assume what it is that you're trying to prove. All right, here we go. The Phenomenology's original titles. Again, the science of the experience of consciousness, or science of the phenomenology of spirit. And here is Tom Rockmore. So the translation of Geist in English is spirit. but it is also rendered in English as mind, or can be rendered as mind. And if Geist is translated as spirit, then the original title of the book, Science of the Experience of Consciousness, describes it rather well. Hegel later changed the title to Science of the Phenomenology of Spirit, probably while he was writing the preface. The book itself is routinely known as the Phenomenology of Spirit, an abbreviation of its title. Miller's recent translation fails to mention that the title he gives to the work is neither of those that Hegel himself chose. All right, here we go. Mind internal versus mind external reality. So as you can see here, I'm using these graphics to help us keep track of this discussion. So we have mind internal in blue and inside the shape, and then we have the shape of consciousness, as it were, and then we have in orange mind external reality. Okay. Notice that the Kantian version of this suggests that mind external reality is a thing, and that the thing presents itself to us. And mind internal reality is a representation or a representation of the mind external thing. Okay, that's the Kantian version. Okay, now notice that Hegel wants to say that if you're conscious of the thing, then it is mind internal. This is Hegel's version. So suddenly, notice both of the numbers appear inside the shape, and they both are blue. The difference then, once you accept that initial move of Hegel's in relation to Kant, the difference then between 1 and 2 are forms of consciousness. Why are they forms of consciousness? They're forms of consciousness because 2 is inside of the mind. It's considered part of consciousness because you are conscious of it. Now, this then is Hegel's circular epistemology. Okay? And it's we're going to just very quickly run right back through it one more time. Okay, so here we go. All right, so we have mind internal versus mind external reality. The Kantian version is that mind external reality, and you've got all the Hegelians, right? The Hegelians that are Marxists then as well. So for example, Zizek denies this. He just denies it, which makes him a very good Hegelian Marxist, right? So the Kantian version is that, and the Deleuzian version is Kantian. So Deleuze is going to say that number 2 is expressing itself. And as number 2 expresses itself, it expresses itself, one of the ways it expresses itself is in human consciousness, right? So therefore, 2 is expressing itself as 1, right? However, the reason that it's numbered 1 and 2 is because we don't become aware of 2 until 2 expresses itself in consciousness. And so therefore, that's why the representation is first. Something is represented to us, something is represented to us, and then we realize that the thing in itself, right, is prior to the representation ontologically, and also that we are incapable of fully knowing the thing in itself. We know the representation of the thing in itself, but we don't fully know the thing in itself. Many, many ways to argue that as well. Many, many ways to explain that, but I'll just leave it at that for now. So that's the Kantian version. Okay, but Hegel, and I think here it is, right? Here it is. I have tussled with some really powerful Hegelians, and this is where they get you. If you allow them to perpetrate this move on you, then you're stuck. You're in their snares, right? So what they're going to say to you is that, well, but you're conscious of the thing, aren't you? Right? So you've got a representation of the thing, and then you're going to say, well, I'm in consciousness with this representation. right, with one. So now you're going to say that there's a two, but aren't I still in consciousness? If I'm thinking of the two, if I'm conscious of the two, and if you accept that, right, then you're stuck. That's it. That's it. Then the whole rest of the phenomenology of spirit, right, is just going to be you saying to yourself, oh, two is inside, two is inside, two is inside. Okay, so this is how they trap you in their snares. And then we go further. Once you're caught in that snare, then the difference, right? Remember, later we're going to say Hegel denies ontological difference. Hegel, here's the Deleuzian critique, right? And this is all over contemporary philosophy. So very quickly,
Hegel
thinks difference in terms of sameness, right?
Hegel
Does not think difference in terms of difference. Difference in terms of difference is outside of that red shape. Difference in terms of difference is orange, not blue, right? Hegel is unable to think difference in terms of difference. And in my opinion, if you really want to think difference in terms of difference, you got to go read Gilles Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. And I just want to say that, so I was very excited being at Duquesne University to get to study with several scholars there. And I remember, how can I say this without, I had a close friend who wanted me to study the person that they sort of took as a master. And so I went out and I got some of the essays and chapters and books that this person had written. And one of the things that they had written was on difference. And I sat down and I read the first sentence and I thought, oh boy, here we go. This is going to be great. I read the second sentence, then I read the third sentence, and then I realized that this person does not understand difference in terms of difference. They understand difference in terms of sameness. And that mistake is so radical that what it does is that it puts you in the wrong paradigm. It just completely puts you in the wrong paradigm. So what I mean by that is that every subsequent thought that you will have will be wrong because you misunderstand the starting point. And that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate that, I don't say it because I'm hostile toward these people or something like that. I don't say it because, and it's nothing personal at all, right? I say it because it's correct. I mean, it philosophically is correct. And they are making such a fundamental philosophical mistake in terms of ontology that they're just absolutely just building castles in the sky. I mean, what they're talking about, what they're doing is not based in reality. Okay. So notice then, if you accept that first move from Hegel, then suddenly 1 and 2 are both inside of consciousness. So both the representation and the presentation. And then you can think that the difference between the representation and the presentation, that the difference between them is a form of consciousness. Thus, the entire rest of the phenomenology of spirit is just working out the forms of consciousness. This is also why later we'll see this is one of the possible ways that you can think of Plato's forms. So anyway, we want to make sure that we recognize that we don't want to be doing just the science of consciousness, right? All right, Hegel's epistemology. And you can see that the circularity of this is a circularity that is taking place inside of consciousness. So insofar as thinking that 2 is mind internal is an assumption, and it is an assumption, then you are assuming what you ultimately are proving as you develop the forms of consciousness. So, sorry, Hegel, but you're done. Hegel's circular epistemology. So Hegel's circular epistemology may be envisioned then by the analogy of consciousness as a bubble I actually came up with a better astronaut image. I got one of these AI generated images of an astronaut, but I just ran out of time. I didn't get a chance to put it in here. It's just so busy. But Hegel's shorter logic, that is logic part 1 of the encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences, right? Here he says, the idea is the truth. For truth is the correspondence of objectivity with the notion. By that correspondence, however, is not meant the correspondence of external things with my conceptions. In the idea, we have nothing to do with external things. You can see what I'm doing with the red shape. So here, Hegel is admitting it, right? Hegel is admitting that ultimately his circular epistemology is tautological, assuming what it sets out to prove and taking place solely within consciousness. If you take Hegel by way of his original titles to be only studying the science of consciousness, then this is not such a problem, right? We can say, well, maybe this can help us understand the contours of consciousness. But if you take Hegel's circular epistemology as an explication of phenomenology or an explication of reality by way of phenomenology, then you're making an extreme mistake. Okay, so let's keep going. And yet again, everything actual, insofar as it is true, is the idea. Everything actual, insofar as it is true, is the idea, and has its truth by and in virtue of the idea alone. Every individual being is some one aspect of the idea. And yet again, everything actual, insofar as it is true, is the idea. So prior to the highlighting of this passage, the highlighting in this passage, you can see that there is some sense in which if we remain confined to the science of the structures of consciousness, that possibly then we could say, well, that's the proper jurisdiction of Hegel's phenomenology, so to speak. However, if we go beyond this passage that's highlighted, notice that Hegel himself then seems to be suggesting that all of the real also is being explicated when these forms of consciousness are being explicated. And that's a radical problem, right? That's a mistake that overlooks ontological difference. So let's take a look at what's being said here in this regard. So, and yet, these are Hegel's words, right? And yet, again, everything actual, insofar as it is true, is the idea. Notice the idea here refers to that red shape. And has its truth by and in virtue of the idea alone. Every individual being is some one aspect of the idea. So if you understand what Hegel gets up to later, you can see that it's already here in its sketched out form. The logic of it is already laid down here. And so, again, I think that the whole thing is problematic. And I'm siding with Kant and Schelling and Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer when I say that. But there is some sense in which we can at least make this distinction between, is Hegel just talking about the science of consciousness, or is Hegel in some way attempting to articulate the ontological truth of spirit? And again, in both cases, his epistemology is circular, and that this is highly problematic, right? So you may be, to go back to the bubble metaphor, you may be able to articulate the relationship between the appearances that are happening inside of the astronaut helmet, right? You may be able to articulate the differences between the things that are inside the bubble, but you are still not able to articulate that which is different from what is inside the bubble in terms of its difference. So Hegel is very problematic. His epistemology is circular and problematic. All right. Okay, so the dilemma between, do mind external things exist, or is it somehow all mind? So this is the Buddhist way of thinking about this same kind of philosophical problem. There are a number of different ways to understand Buddhism and Buddhist ontology. One of those ways is as endorsing an all-mind ontology. There are a number of ways to understand Plato's theory of forms. One way is to understand all minds as participating in the mind of the one. So the next few slides are critical of Hegel's circular epistemology. And so I guess I'm just saying this in passing here, but the idea is that you do find these, if I want to call it a mistake, right? Because I think it is a philosophical mistake. However, you do find these theoretical choices, if we're trying to be less aligned with the truth, we could say you do find these theoretical choices in other places. Like, for example, one way to read Plato and also one way to read Buddhism. Okay, so then in terms of paradigm theories, we could say here the hinge point between the Kantian and Hegelian paradigms is the thing in itself, right? So the question of how to contextualize the thing in itself. All right, so the logic stays the same even when you rotate the theory. The all-mind theory, as we saw above, can be deconstructed at its point of contact with what it is not. Thus, the all-mind theory sees material non-mind as a mental illusion. That's Hegel. Notice then, when it is famously turned right side up and understood as standing on its feet instead of its head, material is supposed to be the only reality, and non-material consciousness is understood as an illusion. That is Zizek. So the point here, though, is that however you rotate this theory, it's a circle. So it just keeps rendering it the same way. So is there any surprise that Kant referred to the outcome of the employment of such logic as transcendental illusion? So it leaves one identifying one's self by negating what one is not. All right, Heidegger's declaration regarding Hegel's philosophy. Now, there are other places where Heidegger agrees with Hegel. So I tend to not say things like, well, I'm siding with Heidegger here. Because it just kind of depends on where you're looking at Heidegger. Sometimes it seems like Heidegger is doing the Hegel thing. The passage, forgive me, it's in the basic writings. It's in one of those essays. I think it's in What is Metaphysics. But, it doesn't matter. The point here is that if you really want to use philosophers to criticize Hegel, you don't need to use Heidegger. I like it. It moves fast to say ontological difference, but you can use the philosophers who are contemporary with Hegel, such as we have Kant and Schelling and Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard. Okay, but here, Heidegger from the Basic Problems of Phenomenology, discussing the is, These are screenshots from my dissertation. They're discussing the is. Heidegger calls for a shift from the conceptual to the apperceptive standpoint, noting, and here's a quote from Heidegger, "The problem will make no further progress as long as logic itself has not been taken back again into ontology. As long as Hegel, who, in contrast, dissolved ontology into logic, is not comprehended. And this means always that Hegel must be overcome." These are Heidegger's words. "This overcoming of Hegel is the intrinsically necessary step in the development of Western philosophy, which must be made for it to remain at all alive." So you've heard me say some pretty strong and kind of extreme things about Hegel, but here you can see that really whenever I'm saying those things, I'm echoing Heidegger. In a deep sense, Heidegger's critique of Hegel echoes Schelling's and Kierkegaard's critiques of Hegel. We took a glance at those in the episode on nihilism regarding Hegel. In Heidegger's vocabulary, his critique of Hegel may be articulated in this way, that Hegel's absolute one, the all-mind, misunderstands the ontological difference, that is, the difference between being and beings. Hegel thereby interprets difference in terms of identity. Deleuze later emphasizes the same critique of Hegel. If Hegel were a hypnotist, he would have taught you a logic fallaciously grounded, so that every particular you look at fits into a general, which fits into his logic, and has you reading everything in terms of the relations of his logic without ever seeing a thing. We've got to overcome Hegel.